The streets of early 1900s New York were not just bustling with activity, they were alive with the pulse of dreams, ambition, and something darker, crime. But amidst this chaos, there was a figure whose rise would forever change the city's underworld. He wasn't the loudest or the most ostentatious, but his very presence seemed to cast a shadow over the city, a figure who would come to define not just New York, but the very structure of organized crime in America. His name: Lucky Luciano. As we delve into his life, we must first understand that Luciano's legacy is both fascinating and elusive. He wasn't just another gangster, he was the architect of the modern mafia. But how did this young immigrant from a small Italian village transform into the most feared and revered man in the criminal world? How did someone who rose from nothing become the puppet master pulling the strings of an entire empire? To understand Luciano's genius, we must first step back and paint a picture of the world into which he was born. Imagine the dense streets of Lower Manhattan, a neighborhood where the air was thick with the sounds of immigrant families, each struggling to carve out a life in a new land. The Lower East Side, a place where opportunity and desperation collided in a mixture of hope and survival, was the perfect breeding ground for someone like Luciano. He was no different from the other children of immigrants, trying to make sense of a world where the American dream seemed just out of reach. Yet, there was something different about him. Perhaps it was the glint in his eye when he looked at the world around him, or maybe it was the way he listened, always observing, always learning. But let's not romanticize his beginnings. Luciano's life wasn't marked by a traditional childhood of innocence and dreams. Born in 1897 in the heart of Sicily, he was thrust into a world defined by poverty, struggle, and the relentless grip of fate. His family arrived in New York when he was just a child, seeking a better life but finding only hardship. The chaotic and often unforgiving environment of the immigrant neighborhood shaped Luciano's early years. It was here, on the streets of this gritty world, that his destiny began to take root. From a young age, Luciano understood that survival wasn't just about working hard, it was about power, influence, and making the right connections. He wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but he had something far more valuable: an ability to think ahead, to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. As a young boy, he quickly learned that the streets were a place where respect wasn't given freely, it had to be earned. And Luciano, even in his youth, was willing to do whatever it took to earn it. His early forays into crime were almost instinctive. At first, it was petty thefts, small, inconsequential acts of survival. But those early crimes were a glimpse of something more significant. They weren't just about getting by, they were about learning the game, understanding the rules, and figuring out how to bend them to his advantage. His charm, his intelligence, and his quick thinking would soon draw the attention of the bigger players in the criminal world. It wasn't long before Luciano's talents caught the eye of the older men who ran the rackets. By the time he was in his late teens, he had already become a part of the criminal underworld. His name was whispered in the back rooms of speakeasies, in the shadows of the streets, and in the corners of bars where the most powerful men in New York gathered to discuss business that was often more about crime than anything else. But even as he became more deeply entrenched in this world, Luciano never lost sight of his goal: to rise above it all, to build something larger than the petty crimes that surrounded him. At the time, New York was a city defined by chaos. Gangs fought for territory, and organized crime was fragmented, each group working independently, with little to no oversight. But Luciano was different. He didn't just want to rule the streets, he wanted to organize them, to bring structure to the chaos. This ambition would be the driving force behind everything he would do in the coming years. In the early 1920s, Luciano formed an alliance that would change the course of mafia history. His partnership with Meyer Lansky, a fellow immigrant with a sharp mind for business, was the beginning of a new era. Lansky, with his financial genius, and Luciano, with his street smarts and natural charisma, complemented each other perfectly. Together, they began to shape the future of organized crime in America. But their rise wasn't without obstacles. The most significant challenge to Luciano's vision came in the form of Salvatore Maranzano, the boss of one of the most powerful mafia families in New York. Maranzano was a traditionalist, someone who believed in the old ways of doing business, the ways that Luciano knew were no longer sustainable. Maranzano's refusal to change and his attempts to consolidate power under his own rule were seen as a direct threat to Luciano's dream of a more organized, more profitable underworld. The tension between the two men escalated quickly, and what followed was one of the bloodiest and most infamous periods in mafia history. Luciano's strategic mind led him to make a decision that would change the game forever. He betrayed Maranzano, orchestrating a hit that would rid him of his old mentor and solidify his position as the most powerful figure in the mafia. It was a brutal and daring move, but it was one that demonstrated just how far Luciano was willing to go to achieve his vision. With Maranzano dead, Luciano assumed control of the most powerful criminal empire in New York. But this wasn't just about power, it was about creating something that would last. Luciano understood that in order to make the mafia a true force to be reckoned with, it needed structure, it needed order, and most of all, it needed a system that would ensure everyone in the organization had a stake in its success. This system became known as the Commission, a governing body of mafia bosses who would regulate and oversee organized crime. It was a brilliant stroke of strategy, and it would cement Luciano's place in history as the man who revolutionized the mafia. But Luciano's rise to power didn't come without its complications. As his influence grew, so did the risks. The more power he accumulated, the more enemies he made. But Luciano was never one to shy away from danger. He thrived in the shadows, knowing that the most successful criminals were those who understood the art of subtlety. The public may have seen him as just another gangster, but in reality, he was the mastermind behind one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises the world had ever seen. Even at the height of his power, Luciano knew that the game was never over. The streets of New York, and indeed the world, were filled with men who would stop at nothing to take what he had built. But Luciano had already anticipated this. He was always thinking several steps ahead, always planning for what came next. His rise was not just about creating an empire, it was about building something that would outlast him, something that would endure even when he was no longer around. And then, as quickly as he had risen to the top, Luciano's empire began to crumble. Betrayal, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of power would eventually catch up to him. His arrest, his trial, and his eventual exile were moments of profound loss, but even in the face of defeat, Luciano's mind never stopped working. Even from afar, he continued to pull the strings, proving that the architect of the mafia was never truly out of the game. But Luciano's story didn't end there. As his health failed him in the years following his release from prison, his final days were marked by a quiet reflection on a life that had been as complex as it was legendary. He had built an empire from nothing, and in the end, he had built it to last. Luciano's legacy is one of power, innovation, and a ruthlessness that knew no bounds. His story is a testament to the idea that sometimes, it is those who understand how to navigate chaos that rise to the top. He wasn't just a gangster, he was the man who reshaped the very foundations of organized crime, a man who would forever remain one of the most influential figures in American criminal history. The streets of early 1900s New York were a place of dreams and despair, a city where the American dream seemed to promise opportunity, but where many found only hardship. It was a city of immigrants, each hoping for a better life but finding only the harsh reality of poverty and struggle. Among these immigrants was a young boy named Salvatore Lucania, later known to the world as Lucky Luciano. Born in Sicily in 1897, Luciano's story began not with luxury or privilege, but with the heavy burden of survival. His family, like many others, sought a new life in the land of opportunity, only to face a world that was unkind to those who didn't belong. They settled in the rough neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan, a place where the streets were filled with noise, tension, and the relentless hum of life that didn't care about your past or your dreams. Here, amidst the squalor and the hustle of immigrant life, Luciano's destiny would begin to take shape. From a young age, Luciano's life was defined by the struggle to adapt. His family was poor, and the dream of prosperity felt like a distant illusion. Like so many children of immigrants, Luciano learned early that survival meant adapting to the harshness around him. The streets were a battleground, a place where respect had to be earned, not given. It was in this chaotic world that Luciano's natural abilities began to show. While other boys played in the streets, Luciano was already observing, learning, and figuring out how to make his way in a world that seemed set against him. His childhood was far from ordinary, but it was ordinary in the way that every child of that era's struggles were, filled with moments of desperation, fleeting joy, and a sense of inevitability that one's future would be shaped by the environment around them. It didn't take long for Luciano to realize that the American dream wasn't something you could simply wait for, it was something you had to take. But unlike many who turned to hard labor or honest work, Luciano saw a different path: crime. At first, it was small-time thefts, petty hustles, and cons, actions that might seem innocent in the eyes of a boy trying to survive. But even in those early, insignificant acts, Luciano began to understand the rules of the game. Crime wasn't just about breaking the law, it was about understanding power, influence, and the art of negotiation. It wasn't long before his small-time ventures caught the attention of those who saw something more in him than a mere street kid. He wasn't the biggest or the toughest, but he had a knack for making connections, for getting what he wanted with nothing more than his charm and his cunning. By the time Luciano was a teenager, his reputation on the streets had begun to grow. He wasn't yet a part of the big leagues of crime, but he was becoming known. He learned from older, more experienced criminals, taking in every lesson they had to offer. But Luciano was no mere apprentice. Even then, he was already thinking bigger. He wasn't just interested in hustling for quick cash or petty power. He had a vision, one that would set him apart from the other men in his world. Luciano was different, he saw the bigger picture, and his ambitions were far greater than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't long before he met those who would help him along the way, those who would become key figures in the criminal empire he would eventually build. Meyer Lansky, a fellow immigrant with a sharp mind for business, would become one of Luciano's closest allies. Lansky was everything Luciano wasn't: quiet, calculating, and above all, smart. But together, they would become an unstoppable force in the world of organized crime. While Lansky focused on the financial aspects of their operations, Luciano saw the big picture. It was not enough to run a few rackets or control a small area of the city. Luciano dreamed of something larger, something more organized. He wanted to bring structure to the chaos of the underworld, to create an empire that could rival the most powerful corporations in the world. But this vision wouldn't come easy. It would require strategy, ruthlessness, and, above all, the willingness to do whatever it took to achieve his goals. As Luciano's power began to grow, so did his influence. He wasn't just a small-time crook anymore, he was becoming a major player in the criminal world. But to truly rise to the top, Luciano would have to confront the men who controlled New York's mafia families. The most powerful of these was Salvatore Maranzano, the head of one of the most dominant mafia families in the city. Maranzano was a traditionalist, someone who adhered to the old ways of the mafia. He believed in maintaining strict hierarchy and order, a system that Luciano thought was outdated. The tension between the two men was palpable, and it didn't take long before their conflict escalated into open warfare. This war, known as the Castellammarese War, would not only determine who would control New York's underworld but also shape the future of organized crime in America. The Castellammarese War was brutal. It was a time of bloodshed, betrayal, and power plays. But while Maranzano's faction fought with brute force, Luciano approached the war with cold, calculated strategy. He understood that this wasn't just about muscle, it was about control, about using intelligence and foresight to outmaneuver his opponents. Luciano knew that the war wasn't just a battle for territory, it was a battle for control of the very structure of the mafia. And he wasn't about to let Maranzano win. The war was long and bloody, but Luciano's strategic genius eventually led him to victory. With Maranzano dead, Luciano emerged as the undisputed leader of the mafia in New York. But this victory was more than just the defeat of a rival, it was the beginning of a new era in organized crime. Luciano wasted no time in consolidating his power. He understood that in order to make his vision a reality, he needed to create a system that would ensure peace and stability within the mafia. It wasn't enough to control the streets, he needed to control the entire system. And so, he created the Commission, a governing body made up of the leaders of the most powerful mafia families in the country. The Commission would serve as a way to regulate crime, to ensure that every family had a say in the business of the underworld. It was a brilliant move, one that would forever change the way the mafia operated. No longer would it be a chaotic, fragmented world of competing interests. Under Luciano's leadership, the mafia became a well-oiled machine, each member playing their part in a larger system. But with power came risks. As Luciano's influence grew, so did his enemies. The more powerful he became, the more dangerous it became to be associated with him. But Luciano was no ordinary gangster. He understood that in order to maintain control, he needed to keep his enemies close and his friends closer. He played the game with unmatched skill, always staying several steps ahead of those who sought to take him down. His rise was no accident, it was the result of years of careful planning, brutal decisions, and a willingness to do whatever it took to reach the top. Despite the ever-present danger, Luciano thrived. He expanded his empire, taking control of illegal gambling, bootlegging, and prostitution. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a businessman, building an empire that would rival the legitimate businesses of the day. And yet, for all his success, Luciano remained a shadowy figure, always in control, but never seeking the spotlight. His reputation was one of fear and respect, but he was not a man of public acclaim. He understood that true power lay not in being seen, but in being untouchable. However, Luciano's rise to power wasn't without its complications. The more influence he gained, the more enemies he made. As his empire expanded, so did the risks. But Luciano was always prepared, always thinking several steps ahead. His ability to stay in the shadows, to manipulate those around him while keeping his hands clean, was what made him so dangerous. He wasn't a thug, he was a mastermind, orchestrating every move with precision and care. Even as his enemies closed in, Luciano remained calm, cool, and collected. He knew that the game was never truly over, that power was always in flux, and that the moment you stopped playing was the moment you lost. Luciano's early years weren't marked by the luxuries or comforts that many might associate with the rise to power. His childhood was a rough and raw introduction to a world where survival wasn't a given but a constant fight. In the overcrowded, cramped streets of Lower Manhattan, he quickly learned that in order to survive, you had to be quick, smart, and, at times, ruthless. As a child of immigrants, Luciano was thrust into a world that was unforgiving to outsiders, where the American dream often seemed just out of reach. But what he saw in the streets of New York was more than just hardship, it was a place where power was currency, and respect was something that had to be fought for. And even as a boy, he understood that to rise above the poverty and crime surrounding him, he would need to master the game in ways most could not fathom. His early involvement in petty crimes was almost a necessity. The temptation to steal from the corner store, to hustle a little extra cash here and there, was not just about gaining money, it was about learning the rules of the streets. And Luciano was a quick study. He learned early that survival wasn't simply about avoiding trouble, it was about knowing when to strike, when to lay low, and, most importantly, how to navigate the complex world of New York's underbelly. His first brush with crime was not the grand, dramatic moments often romanticized in gangster films. Instead, it was smaller, stealing from stores, running little scams, and hanging around with older boys who taught him the tricks of the trade. At first, these actions seemed inconsequential, just a way to get by. But over time, they began to shape him. Luciano began to see a world where crime was not a symptom of desperation but a way of life, a way to climb the ladder when the ordinary routes were closed off. Each small crime was a lesson, a piece of a puzzle that would eventually lead him to the pinnacle of organized crime. It wasn't long before Luciano started to make connections. The neighborhood was full of criminals, men who, like him, had come from nothing and were willing to do anything to rise. But Luciano wasn't just a street hustler, he had something more. He had an uncanny ability to observe, to see the bigger picture when others were focused only on their immediate surroundings. Even at a young age, he was already thinking several steps ahead. He wasn't content to simply survive, he wanted to thrive. And he knew that in order to do that, he would need to move beyond petty crimes and into something bigger, something more structured. It was at this point in his life that Luciano began to see the limits of small-time hustles. As he got older, he realized that the real money was not in stealing from corner stores or hustling a few bucks from unsuspecting marks, it was in organized crime. And in order to succeed, he would need to align himself with the right people, those who had the power and the connections to elevate him beyond the narrow confines of his neighborhood. It was a lesson in ambition, one that would shape his path in ways that few could have predicted. It was also at this stage that Luciano met the men who would become his mentors, and later, his allies. Men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, powerful figures in the mafia world who would take him under their wing and introduce him to the true workings of organized crime. But while these men were the stepping stones to his rise, Luciano always knew that he was different. He was not like the others who were content to operate within the confines of tradition. He saw the limitations of the old mafia system and knew that in order to build something lasting, something that would rival even the most established criminal organizations, he would need to think differently. It was during this time that Luciano began to form alliances that would change the course of mafia history. One of the most significant of these was with Meyer Lansky, a fellow immigrant who had a mind for numbers and business. Lansky was the perfect complement to Luciano. While Luciano was a street-smart, calculating visionary, Lansky had the financial savvy and the cool-headed demeanor that would make their partnership formidable. Together, they formed the foundation for what would become a new era in organized crime. But even as Luciano forged these alliances, he never lost sight of the goal that had driven him from the very beginning, to build something larger than himself. He didn't just want to control a few small rackets, he wanted to revolutionize the entire criminal world. He wanted to create a system, a well-oiled machine, where everyone in the organization had a stake, and everyone worked together for the common goal. And in order to do that, he would need to gain control of the most powerful mafia families in New York. As Luciano began to make his move, he faced an obstacle in the form of Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano was an old-school mafia boss, a traditionalist who believed in maintaining a strict hierarchy and a set of rules that Luciano saw as outdated and ineffective. Maranzano's refusal to adapt to the changing world of crime created a rift between him and Luciano, one that would eventually lead to the most pivotal moment in Luciano's life, the Castellammarese War. The war itself was a brutal, bloody struggle for control of the mafia in New York. But while Maranzano relied on violence and brute force, Luciano used his strategic mind to outmaneuver his opponent. Rather than fight Maranzano head-on, Luciano sought to weaken his rival from within. He knew that the war wasn't just about territory, it was about control of the system, about reshaping the mafia in his own image. And Luciano was willing to do whatever it took to achieve that goal, even if it meant making a move that would shock the entire criminal world: betrayal. The decision to betray Maranzano wasn't one Luciano took lightly. He had worked alongside the man, learned from him, and even relied on his guidance at times. But Luciano's vision for the future of the mafia was too grand, too important to be stifled by old-world thinking. Maranzano's death would not only clear the path for Luciano's rise to power, but it would also mark the beginning of a new era in organized crime, an era defined by structure, organization, and, most importantly, control. With Maranzano out of the picture, Luciano moved quickly to solidify his control over New York's mafia families. But unlike previous bosses who ruled through fear and violence, Luciano sought to create a system that would benefit everyone. He understood that the mafia needed a structure, a governing body that would ensure peace and order among the families. And so, he established the Commission, a group of powerful mafia bosses who would work together to regulate and oversee the activities of the underworld. It was a masterstroke, one that not only cemented Luciano's power but also set the stage for the future of organized crime in America. Yet even as Luciano's empire grew, so did the risks. The more power he accumulated, the more enemies he made. But Luciano was never one to shy away from danger. He thrived in the shadows, always watching, always calculating, and always thinking several steps ahead. His ability to remain untouchable, to control the underworld without ever drawing too much attention to himself, was one of his greatest strengths. He understood that power wasn't about being seen, it was about being respected, and above all, being feared. As Luciano expanded his reach into illegal gambling, bootlegging, and other illicit activities, his influence spread far beyond New York. He had created an empire, one that was not just about crime but about control, an empire built on loyalty, discipline, and a vision for the future. Luciano wasn't just a gangster, he was a businessman, a visionary, and a mastermind. But as his empire grew, so did the complications. His enemies, both within and outside the Mafia, were always plotting to take him down. But Luciano was never caught off guard. He was always thinking, always planning, and always ready for whatever came next. But as with all empires, Luciano's rise to power would eventually be followed by his downfall. The same ruthlessness and ambition that had propelled him to the top would eventually catch up with him. His arrest, trial, and eventual exile marked the end of an era for Luciano, but even in his darkest hours, his mind never stopped working. From the shadows of exile, Luciano continued to pull the strings of his criminal empire, proving that a true mastermind could never truly be defeated. In the chaotic and fragmented world of early 20th century New York, alliances were everything. The harsh realities of street life, where survival often meant knowing who to trust, who to fear, and who to work with, were lessons Luciano absorbed early on. He wasn't content with simply being a player in the game, he was determined to reshape the game itself. One of the most important alliances that would eventually shape Luciano's path to power was with Meyer Lansky, a fellow immigrant whose calm, calculated approach to business would complement Luciano's street-smart, ambitious drive. Lansky, unlike many in the world of organized crime, was not merely interested in making a quick profit. He was a mastermind when it came to finance, and his ability to think beyond the narrow confines of street-level operations made him an invaluable partner for Luciano. At the time, Luciano was still carving out his place in the mafia world. He had moved past the petty crimes of his youth and was now navigating the complex world of organized crime, where power was consolidated not just by violence and fear, but by strategy, intellect, and control over key resources. Luciano's world was no longer confined to petty theft or street-level hustles. He had his sights set on something much larger. The alliances he made during this time, particularly with Lansky, were pivotal in cementing his future as one of the most influential figures in American organized crime. Lansky, for all his cool-headed brilliance, was initially skeptical of Luciano. At first glance, Luciano seemed more like a streetwise hustler than the kind of man who could build a criminal empire. He was brash, bold, and, at times, reckless. But it didn't take long for Lansky to see the depth of Luciano's ambition and vision. While Lansky had the financial expertise, Luciano had the street smarts, the ability to navigate the treacherous waters of mafia politics, and, above all, a relentless drive to reshape the criminal world. Together, they formed a partnership that would forever alter the course of mafia history. The alliance between Luciano and Lansky wasn't just about mutual respect, it was about understanding each other's strengths and leveraging them for their mutual gain. Lansky saw that Luciano wasn't just another gangster. Luciano was a visionary, someone who understood that organized crime needed to evolve, that it couldn't remain a chaotic, fragmented world of independent families. Luciano wasn't content with merely running a few rackets or controlling a few neighborhoods, he wanted to build something bigger, something that would unite the disparate factions of organized crime and make them more powerful and more profitable. And Lansky, with his financial acumen, was the perfect partner to help turn Luciano's vision into reality. As Luciano's influence in the criminal world continued to grow, so did his ambitions. He understood that to achieve his goal of building a criminal empire, he needed to control not just the streets but also the key industries that powered the economy. Bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution were just the beginning. But even as Luciano expanded his operations, he remained keenly aware of the dangers that came with power. The more territory he controlled, the more enemies he made, and the more threats he faced. But it wasn't just violence that threatened his ascent, it was the mafia itself, with its rigid structures, long-standing traditions, and internal politics. In a world where loyalty was everything, and betrayal was often punished with death, Luciano knew that the traditional mafia structure was outdated and too unstable. The underworld was divided, with various families vying for control, and each family had its own interests, its own turf, and its own way of doing business. Luciano was different. He saw the fractured nature of the mafia as a problem that needed to be solved. He didn't just want to rule over his own turf, he wanted to unite the entire mafia world. And to do that, he would need to create a new system, a system that would replace the old, hierarchical structure with something more organized, more efficient, and more profitable. The idea of creating a governing body to oversee all mafia activity was groundbreaking. At the time, the mafia was a loose confederation of independent families, each working more or less on their own. There was no central authority, no body that could resolve disputes between families or regulate the various illegal activities they engaged in. The chaos was both a strength and a weakness. While it allowed families to operate independently, it also created instability, with constant infighting and power struggles. Luciano's vision was to create a new structure, an organized syndicate that would unify the mafia under one umbrella, bringing order to the chaos and ensuring that the families could operate more efficiently and, most importantly, more profitably. But in order to implement this vision, Luciano needed to eliminate those who stood in his way. The first obstacle was Salvatore Maranzano, the boss of one of the most powerful mafia families in New York. Maranzano, like many old-school mafia bosses, believed in the traditional structure of power, one man at the top, with absolute control over his family and its operations. Maranzano's insistence on maintaining this old-school way of doing business was a direct challenge to Luciano's vision. Maranzano, who saw Luciano as a rising threat, tried to consolidate his power and eliminate anyone who opposed him. It was a dangerous game, and one that Luciano was unwilling to lose. The tension between the two men came to a head in what would become known as the Castellammarese War. This bloody conflict would be the crucible in which Luciano's future was forged. It was a war for control of New York's underworld, a war that would ultimately see Luciano's rise to power and the end of Maranzano's reign. But it wasn't just a war for territory, it was a war of ideas, a war for the future of the mafia itself. Luciano wasn't fighting for the same old power structure that Maranzano clung to, he was fighting for a new way of doing business, one that would give him control over not just New York, but the entire American mafia. The war was brutal, with bloodshed on both sides, but Luciano's strategic genius soon became evident. Rather than relying on brute force, he used his cunning to outmaneuver Maranzano and his supporters. Luciano knew that the key to victory wasn't in direct confrontation, it was in manipulation, in turning Maranzano's allies against him, and in exploiting the weaknesses of the old system. As the war raged on, Luciano's forces slowly but surely gained the upper hand. And then, in a move that would cement his status as the true power behind the mafia, Luciano orchestrated the assassination of Maranzano, eliminating his rival and securing his position as the new boss of New York's underworld. With Maranzano out of the picture, Luciano was free to implement his vision for a more organized, more unified mafia. He understood that to build something lasting, he needed to create a system that would ensure stability and prevent the kind of infighting that had plagued the mafia in the past. And so, he created the Commission, a council of mafia bosses that would serve as the governing body of the American Mafia. The Commission would oversee the activities of the various mafia families, resolving disputes, ensuring that everyone had a stake in the business, and ensuring that the mafia remained a well-oiled machine. But the creation of the Commission was not just a pragmatic move, it was also a symbol of Luciano's genius. He had transformed the chaotic, fragmented world of organized crime into a more structured, more powerful force. His vision had become reality, and in doing so, he had ensured that the Mafia would remain a force to be reckoned with for years to come. But even as Luciano expanded his empire and solidified his control over the underworld, he knew that his rise to power had come at a cost. There were always threats lurking in the shadows, always rivals eager to take his place. But Luciano, for all his ambition and cunning, was always a step ahead, always ready to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast those who sought to bring him down. The creation of the Commission marked the beginning of a new era for the Mafia. It was no longer just a collection of independent families, each struggling for control. Under Luciano's leadership, the Mafia had become a well-organized syndicate, one that operated like a business, with clear rules and a shared vision for success. Luciano had transformed the Mafia from a chaotic, fragmented group of criminals into a powerful, unified empire. And in doing so, he had ensured that his legacy would be one of power, influence, and unmatched control. But even as he looked to the future, Luciano knew that the world he had built was fragile, and that power, no matter how carefully constructed, was always at risk. As Luciano's empire grew, so did the stakes. The vision he had long nurtured, the one that had driven him from the chaotic streets of Lower Manhattan to the top of the criminal world, was finally taking shape. The Commission, a groundbreaking innovation in the Mafia structure, promised a new era of unity and stability in an otherwise fractured underworld. Yet, even as Luciano began to consolidate power, the dangers that came with being at the helm of such a vast and complex empire became ever more apparent. His ascent was marked not only by triumphs but by the constant weight of paranoia, rivalries, and betrayal. The very men who helped him rise to power were now the ones who eyed his position with suspicion, some willing to sacrifice him if it meant seizing the top spot. In the years following his victory over Maranzano and the establishment of the Commission, Luciano's reach expanded beyond New York. He wasn't just a player in the city's criminal world, he was a force shaping the entire American Mafia, with influence stretching from Chicago to Havana, and even across the Atlantic. But it wasn't only the geographical spread of his empire that made Luciano a truly revolutionary figure, it was the way he managed his operations. While previous Mafia bosses ruled with an iron fist, relying on violence and fear to maintain control, Luciano's genius lay in his ability to build and sustain a vast network that was structured, organized, and profitable. He understood that the Mafia needed more than just loyalty and muscle, it needed a framework to ensure that everyone had a stake in its success. The Commission was that framework, a system that provided order where there had once been chaos. But as Luciano's power grew, so did the enemies he made, and the first cracks in his empire began to show. The Mafia, after all, was not an institution of stability, it was an organization born of violence, secrecy, and ambition. And ambition, while a driving force for success, was also a dangerous force in the world of crime. Luciano had long known that in the underworld, power was fluid, and loyalty was often temporary. His genius lay in his ability to navigate this delicate balance, using his intelligence and charm to stay several steps ahead of those who would seek to take him down. His most significant challenge during this time came from an unexpected source, the very people who had once been his allies. The so-called Young Turks in the Mafia, the younger, more ambitious figures who saw themselves as the future of the organization, began to question Luciano's methods. While they admired his rise to power, they were also impatient for their own piece of the empire. The Commission, which Luciano had so carefully constructed, was now a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it provided stability and a way for the families to cooperate, but on the other, it left Luciano exposed to scrutiny and dissent. His vision for the Mafia was one of order and professionalism, but to the younger generation, that professionalism was sometimes seen as weakness. They wanted more. They wanted to move faster, to expand into new territories without the constraints of Luciano's careful planning. In this volatile environment, Luciano's strategic mind was tested more than ever. The young men challenging his leadership had their own ideas about how the Mafia should operate, and some of them were not afraid to use violence to achieve their goals. But Luciano knew that violence was not the answer, not anymore. The time for bloodshed, for chaotic power struggles, was over. What was needed now was diplomacy, manipulation, and, above all, a sense of calculated patience. The last thing Luciano wanted was to return to the days of constant war between the families. But he also knew that his power was only as strong as his ability to maintain control over his allies, his subordinates, and his rivals. In the underworld, a single misstep could bring everything crashing down. At this juncture, Luciano's ability to balance power with subtlety became his greatest asset. He understood that in order to maintain his position, he needed to appear both untouchable and indispensable. He didn't need to be feared like Maranzano had been, he needed to be respected, revered even, for his intelligence and vision. And so, he carefully navigated the growing tensions within his organization, appeasing those who questioned his authority while reinforcing his control over the most critical areas of his empire. His approach was one of calculated calm, making decisions behind the scenes, pulling strings without ever seeming to act. Luciano's power was rooted in his ability to manipulate, to outthink his opponents rather than overpower them. He had already demonstrated his mastery of this art when he defeated Maranzano, and now, he would use the same tactics to handle the rising tensions within his own ranks. Yet, despite his careful maneuvers, the pressure continued to mount. The young men challenging Luciano's leadership were not easily swayed, and their impatience with his more cautious approach only grew. It was in this climate of rising tensions that Luciano's most profound test of leadership would emerge. While he had secured his dominance over New York, his empire was now under threat from forces within. This threat would take many forms, but perhaps the most dangerous was the one he least expected, his own men. Luciano's handling of these internal conflicts speaks to his brilliance as a strategist. Where Maranzano had ruled with fear, Luciano ruled with persuasion. He didn't resort to brute force to put down the rising dissent within his organization, instead, he used his ability to read people, to understand their motivations, and to manipulate the situation to his advantage. Luciano knew that loyalty in the Mafia was not absolute, it was transactional. The moment his subordinates felt they could get more by turning against him, they would do so without hesitation. And so, Luciano's success lay in keeping his allies loyal, not by threatening them with violence, but by keeping them invested in the system he had created. But even as he worked to maintain order within his ranks, Luciano was also dealing with external pressures. The government, which had long been an enemy of the Mafia, was now more determined than ever to bring him down. The authorities had always known of Luciano's influence in the underworld, but his ability to stay one step ahead had kept him out of their grasp. Now, however, the pressure from law enforcement was intensifying, and Luciano found himself in a battle not just for control over his empire, but for his very freedom. It was in the face of these external threats that Luciano's brilliance as a strategist truly shone. He understood that in order to survive, he would need to operate in the shadows, to stay hidden from the prying eyes of the law. But he also knew that the more successful his empire became, the more visible it would become to the authorities. As his reach expanded, so did the chances of being caught. In the end, Luciano would have to decide whether to maintain his empire at all costs, or whether to step back from the public eye to preserve his freedom. As Luciano's troubles with law enforcement grew, he began to consider options that would ensure his survival. He was no stranger to the idea of exile, having seen many of his rivals meet their end either through imprisonment or assassination. But Luciano was different. He had built an empire that stretched beyond New York, an empire that could endure even in the face of his personal downfall. And so, Luciano began to lay the groundwork for a new phase of his life, one that would take him out of the public eye and into the relative safety of exile, where he could continue to influence the underworld from afar. The decision to exile himself was not an easy one. It meant relinquishing the power he had worked so hard to build, stepping away from the empire he had created. But Luciano understood that the price of staying at the top of his game was more than just power, it was freedom. And as his enemies closed in and his empire began to unravel, Luciano realized that the best way to preserve both was to step back and let his empire run itself. It was a difficult decision, but in the end, it would be one that allowed Luciano to live out his remaining years in relative peace, even as he continued to pull the strings of his empire from the shadows. The twilight years of Lucky Luciano were marked by both reflection and an undeniable pull towards the empire he had built, even as his life took an unexpected turn. His decision to enter exile wasn't just a physical relocation, it was a strategic retreat, one that showed the level of control and cunning that had characterized his rise. While most would have viewed exile as the end of a reign, for Luciano, it became the next phase of his long game. It wasn't just about disappearing from the public eye, it was about maintaining influence while evading the growing threats from law enforcement and rival factions that sought to destroy everything he had worked for. Luciano's time in exile brought him to the island of Capri, an isolated location that offered the perfect balance of seclusion and access to the world of organized crime. From this vantage point, he was able to orchestrate his criminal empire from the shadows, pulling strings and giving orders without ever needing to step foot in the United States. It was a situation that perfectly suited Luciano's personality. He thrived in the background, where his mind could work without the distractions of direct confrontation. In many ways, his exile was not a retreat from power but a reinvention of it. Luciano had long understood that true power wasn't about being seen, it was about having the ability to influence events from behind the scenes, to make decisions that shaped the course of history without ever needing to raise a finger. Despite his apparent withdrawal from active crime, Luciano never truly left the world he had helped to create. He remained in close contact with his old associates, and his advice was still sought after by those who had risen to power in the Mafia. The commission, which Luciano had set up to regulate the activities of the various Mafia families, continued to function, albeit without his direct presence. The families, now more organized than ever, knew that Luciano was the man who had built this system, and his guidance was invaluable, even if it was delivered from across the Atlantic. In exile, Luciano became the unseen hand, the puppet master who orchestrated the moves of those in power, making sure the system he had created stayed intact. But even in exile, Luciano's mind was always turning. His capacity for strategy never dulled, even as his physical presence faded from the world of crime. Luciano's influence extended far beyond just the Mafia families he had helped to unify, his reach stretched into politics, business, and even international borders. He understood that the world was a game of power dynamics, and he had long mastered the art of playing it. His understanding of criminal enterprises, combined with his ability to network and influence key figures, allowed him to remain at the top even as his empire slowly transitioned into the hands of others. One of the most telling aspects of Luciano's time in exile was his ongoing relationship with the American government. His past, full of arrests, charges, and battles with the law, made him a prime target for law enforcement agencies, but his connection to key political figures and his continued influence over the underworld gave him a peculiar kind of leverage. Despite his criminal past, Luciano's connections with figures in the United States government helped to secure his survival. There were rumors, though never fully substantiated, that Luciano had at times worked with law enforcement, giving them information on rival criminals in exchange for protection and a certain level of freedom. In the twisted, murky waters of organized crime and politics, it was sometimes difficult to tell where loyalty ended and where self-preservation began. Luciano's relationship with the government was never as clear-cut as it might seem. His involvement with law enforcement was complex, rooted in pragmatic necessity. During World War II, for instance, Luciano made himself indispensable to the United States government. With the country embroiled in a war on multiple fronts, securing vital shipping routes became paramount. And who better to help navigate the waters than the man who had control over New York's docks and ports? Luciano had long understood the strategic importance of these areas, and he used this knowledge to strike a deal with the U.S. government. In exchange for his assistance in securing the docks and preventing sabotage by enemy agents, Luciano received leniency in his sentence and, ultimately, a reduced sentence and parole. This partnership between the Mafia and the U.S. government would become one of the most controversial chapters in Luciano's life, yet it was emblematic of his ability to adapt and remain relevant in the ever-changing world of power politics. But Luciano's power was not without its costs. Even in exile, the burden of his actions weighed heavily on him. The life he had built, full of manipulation, betrayal, and ruthless ambition, was no longer one of growth and expansion, it was one of survival. The years of carefully cultivated alliances, of orchestrating power plays and eliminating rivals, began to take their toll. Luciano's exile was marked by a growing sense of disillusionment. He had once believed that he could build something lasting, a legacy that would transcend his own life. But as the years passed, it became clear that the world of organized crime, much like the world of politics, was one in which power was always in flux. The very system Luciano had helped create was now being run by new, younger figures who had little regard for the old ways. One of the greatest challenges to Luciano's power during these years came not from his enemies, but from his own associates. The younger generation of mafia bosses, some of whom had been part of Luciano's original team, were now seeking to expand their own influence. Men like Vito Genovese and Frank Costello, once loyal to Luciano, began to chart their own paths to power. Their ambition, coupled with the natural evolution of the mafia's leadership, meant that Luciano's hold over the organization was slowly slipping. Luciano had known that power in the underworld was fleeting, but seeing his empire slip through his fingers was a bitter pill to swallow. Despite the challenges, Luciano maintained a tight grip on the most important aspects of his operations. His criminal interests in gambling, bootlegging, and prostitution remained lucrative, and his influence within the commission ensured that he still had a say in the direction of the mafia's activities. But his presence in the underworld was no longer as dominant as it once had been. As the years went on, Luciano found himself at a crossroads. He had built a criminal empire unlike any the world had ever seen, and yet, he was now sidelined, a figurehead in a world that had moved on without him. In many ways, Luciano's downfall was not a dramatic fall from grace, but a slow, inevitable fade. His exile, while a strategic move in the short term, became a symbol of his inability to keep up with the changing tides of the underworld. The younger generation, emboldened by his success but uninterested in preserving his legacy, began to push Luciano aside. His empire, once a well-oiled machine, was now a fragmented collection of smaller, competing factions. The structure he had so carefully built was deteriorating, and despite his efforts to stay involved, Luciano was increasingly a man of the past, a relic of an earlier era. But even as Luciano's control over the mafia waned, his name remained synonymous with power. His legacy, though tarnished by the passage of time and the shifting allegiances within the underworld, was still felt. The very system he had created, the commission, remained a powerful tool that shaped the mafia for years after his departure. Even in the years following his decline, Luciano's influence lingered, both within the underworld and in the public consciousness. As Luciano neared the end of his life, he was no longer the ambitious, ruthless mastermind who had orchestrated the rise of a criminal empire. He was a man in retreat, watching from the sidelines as a new generation took control of the world he had once ruled. Yet, in his quiet moments, as he reflected on his life, Luciano would likely have seen the lasting impact of his vision. He had succeeded in uniting the mafia, in turning it from a fractured group of families into a powerful, organized syndicate. His name would forever be linked to that transformation, even if his physical presence no longer commanded the same fear and respect it once had. Luciano passed away in 1962, but his death marked the end of an era, not just for the mafia, but for organized crime as a whole. The world he had created, full of power struggles, criminal enterprises, and shifting alliances, would continue long after his passing. Yet, as the decades went on, it became clear that no one would ever truly fill the void left by Lucky Luciano. His legacy, both celebrated and controversial, would live on, but the man himself was gone. And in the shadows of history, the name Lucky Luciano would remain forever etched as the man who reshaped the mafia, and in doing so, changed the criminal world forever. Lucky Luciano's legacy wasn't just about the empire he built, it was also about the seismic shift he instigated in the way the Mafia operated. His ability to reinvent organized crime, turning it into a more modern, business-like structure, was revolutionary. In the underworld, where loyalty was paramount and tradition was fiercely guarded, Luciano changed the very fabric of the Mafia. He transformed a loose confederation of families into a more formalized and efficient organization. But, as with all great changes, this transformation didn't come without its challenges. Luciano's innovations were not universally welcomed. There were those who viewed his approach as a betrayal of the old ways, a corruption of the traditions that had long governed the Mafia. These were the men who believed that power should be gained through brute force, intimidation, and unquestioning loyalty, rather than the calculated, strategic methods that Luciano used. For many of them, Luciano's vision of a more organized, efficient, and corporate-style mafia seemed like a betrayal of the very principles that had kept them at the top for so long. Yet, despite the resistance, Luciano's ideas began to take hold. The Commission, the governing body he created to regulate mafia affairs and resolve disputes between the various families, was the cornerstone of this new order. It allowed the Mafia to function as a collective, where power was shared among the families, with the Commission acting as a sort of board of directors that ensured that each family had a voice and a stake in the criminal activities that generated massive wealth. This shift toward structure and cooperation, while opposed by some, ultimately proved to be the key to Luciano's success. Under his guidance, the Mafia evolved from a chaotic, decentralized network of criminal enterprises into a more unified, efficient, and profitable organization. Luciano's method of balancing the needs of the various families was a masterstroke. Instead of pitting families against one another in constant turf wars, he brought them together, ensuring that they shared the profits, but also shared the responsibility for maintaining order. The Mafia, under Luciano, was no longer a collection of independent factions fighting for control, it was a single, cohesive entity that operated like a business. In many ways, this transformation reflected Luciano's own mindset. He was not just a gangster, he was a businessman who understood the importance of cooperation, planning, and mutual benefit. He saw the Mafia as a way to make money, and like any successful businessman, he knew that the key to long-term success was creating a system that worked for everyone, not just the boss at the top. This new approach to the Mafia, however, wasn't without its flaws. As Luciano's influence grew, so did the complexity of managing such a vast criminal empire. While the Commission helped maintain order, it also created new tensions. The families, though united under a common cause, were still made up of men who were fiercely competitive, each with their own ambitions and desires for power. The careful balancing act that Luciano had orchestrated became more difficult to maintain as new personalities and new factions emerged within the Mafia. The younger generation of mobsters, who had risen through the ranks during Luciano's reign, began to push for more control and more influence. For them, the old guard, those who had been with Luciano from the beginning, was seen as a barrier to their own rise to power. Luciano's brilliance had always been in his ability to read people, to understand their motivations and desires. It was this skill that allowed him to build alliances and maintain control over his empire. However, as the years went on, even Luciano's keen judgment was tested by the shifting dynamics of the underworld. The Mafia was becoming more fragmented, with younger bosses vying for control over territory, resources, and influence. In the past, Luciano had been able to unite the families with a sense of purpose, but now, that unity was beginning to fray. One of the most significant challenges to Luciano's control came from within his own ranks. Vito Genovese, once a loyal ally, became a serious threat to Luciano's dominance. Genovese had long harbored ambitions of his own and had grown increasingly disillusioned with Luciano's methods. While Luciano had always been a pragmatist, willing to negotiate and make deals, Genovese was more ambitious and less patient. He wanted control, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. In the cutthroat world of organized crime, ambition like Genovese's was a dangerous thing. The conflict between the two men was inevitable. It wasn't just a battle for power, it was a clash of ideologies. Luciano had created a system based on cooperation and strategic planning, while Genovese was determined to follow the old ways, using violence and coercion to secure his position. The tensions between Luciano and Genovese reached a boiling point in the early 1950s. It was during this time that Luciano, feeling the weight of both external pressures from law enforcement and internal unrest within the mafia, began to make plans for his own retreat. While he had always been able to outmaneuver his rivals, the political climate in the United States was becoming more hostile to organized crime. The government, under the leadership of figures like J. Edgar Hoover, was intensifying its crackdown on the mafia, and Luciano knew that his time in the U.S. was running out. The decision to go into exile was not just about avoiding jail, it was about securing his legacy and protecting the empire he had built. Luciano's time in exile was marked by a strange sense of disconnection. Though he was physically removed from the day-to-day operations of the mafia, his mind never stopped working. Even from afar, Luciano continued to influence the direction of the mafia, offering advice, making connections, and ensuring that his empire remained profitable. However, his relationship with his former allies grew strained. As Luciano retreated further into the shadows, the young, ambitious mobsters who had once respected him began to question his relevance. The world of organized crime was changing, and Luciano's older, more traditional approach was becoming less effective in dealing with the fast-moving, unpredictable world of post-war America. As time went on, Luciano's relationship with the mafia continued to evolve. While he remained an iconic figure in the criminal world, his influence began to wane. The younger generation of mobsters, who had grown up under his rule, were now running things. They had learned from his example but were also eager to assert their own dominance. They had their own ideas about how the mafia should operate, and many of them saw Luciano's old methods as outdated. His desire for organization and structure was being replaced by a new ethos of aggression and expansion. Despite this, Luciano remained a respected figure within the mafia, even as his direct influence diminished. His role as the mastermind behind the commission ensured that he would always be remembered as the man who brought order to the chaotic world of organized crime. His vision of a unified, corporate-style mafia, while no longer the guiding principle of the underworld, continued to shape the way the families operated. Luciano's legacy, though tarnished by the shifting dynamics of the mafia, was undeniable. The final years of Luciano's life were marked by a growing sense of nostalgia. He had spent his youth building an empire, and now, in his later years, he was watching it slip away. But even in his exile, Luciano couldn't help but look back with a sense of pride. He had built something that had never existed before, a criminal organization that was not only powerful but structured and organized. He had changed the face of the mafia and had made it an unstoppable force in the criminal world. And though he no longer held the reins, the mark he had left on the mafia was indelible. Luciano died in 1962, but even in death, he remained a towering figure in the annals of organized crime. His death marked the end of an era, but his legacy continued to live on, not only in the mafia families that continued to operate but in the way the world viewed organized crime. Luciano had proven that it was possible to create something larger than oneself, something that could withstand time and change. Though he was no longer at the helm, his name would forever be associated with the rise of the modern mafia. He had transformed organized crime into a business, a brutal, dangerous business, but a business nonetheless. And in doing so, he had changed the course of history. As Lucky Luciano's influence over the American Mafia continued to fade with his exile, the world he had shaped didn't simply wither, it evolved, morphing into something more dangerous, more widespread, and more resilient than anyone could have imagined. His departure, which many saw as the end of an era, did not erase his legacy, instead, it allowed the Mafia to grow into a new phase. It was no longer a simple criminal syndicate, it was a global operation, with influence stretching far beyond the streets of New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Under the guidance of a new generation of Mafia bosses, Luciano's organizational model, though challenged by internal strife, became the blueprint for a worldwide criminal empire. While Luciano's direct control waned, his principles remained the foundation upon which the Mafia stood. The Commission, his crowning achievement, continued to serve as the structural backbone for the Mafia. The system he had put in place to regulate and mediate disputes among Mafia families was not just a successful organizational tactic, it was a necessity. Under Luciano's careful watch, the Mafia had been transformed from a chaotic and often self-destructive group of individual families into a far-reaching, highly organized criminal cartel that stretched across continents. It was a business model, one that could generate wealth far beyond the criminal underworld. But with Luciano's absence, the Mafia was no longer united under one vision. Power, as it always does, shifted hands. The younger generation of Mafia bosses, like Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and others, were beginning to carve out their own spaces of influence. They weren't just following in Luciano's footsteps, they were reshaping the structure he had built, refining it to suit their own ambitions. The Commission, once a symbol of unity, began to fracture as these ambitious men jockeyed for control, each seeking to carve out a larger portion of the empire. As Luciano watched from his distant exile, it must have been clear to him that the very system he had created was now under siege. Genovese, who had once been a trusted ally, was now a threat, seeking to overthrow Luciano's carefully constructed order and impose his own rule. Genovese's ambition had always been one of the most dangerous forces within the Mafia, and with Luciano no longer in the picture, he began to make his play for dominance. His challenge was not just to Luciano, but to the very vision of the Mafia as a unified entity. Genovese saw the new generation of mobsters as weak, compromised by Luciano's approach to diplomacy, and his growing control over the Genovese crime family was only the beginning of his effort to consolidate power. In many ways, Genovese's rise was a stark contrast to Luciano's approach. Where Luciano had used brains over brawn, Genovese was willing to take more aggressive actions. Genovese wanted to return to the old ways of Mafia rule, the ones rooted in fear, intimidation, and control through violent retribution. This ideology stood in stark contrast to the organized, strategic model Luciano had championed, and it set the stage for conflict not just between Genovese and Luciano, but within the entire Mafia system. The very foundation of the Mafia's power, its unity and structure, began to crumble as ambitious new players, many of them eager to emulate Luciano's success, pursued their own goals. Despite the increasing threats to his empire, Luciano, ever the strategist, did not simply disappear into the shadows of his exile. He continued to stay in touch with those he had once worked with, maintaining his influence through strategic conversations and indirect dealings. From his quiet hideaway on Capri, he would have been acutely aware of the internal power struggles, the ever-shifting allegiances, and the growing tensions within the Mafia. But Luciano's ability to maintain control, even from afar, was testament to his unique genius. Even in his absence, he was still a powerful figure in the underworld, his name carrying weight whenever a Mafia boss made a deal or brokered a dispute. Luciano's vision for the Mafia had always been to transform it from a loose conglomerate of independent families into a more cohesive, streamlined operation. But in the decades following his exile, the Mafia had begun to splinter once again. While the Commission had kept things relatively stable in the past, the new generation of Mafia bosses were more inclined to take risks and pursue their own agendas. They weren't content to simply sit at the table with their fellow bosses, they wanted to dominate, to control the flow of money, to expand into new territories. The Commission, once a symbol of unity, became a battleground for dominance. This fracturing of the Mafia brought with it a new set of challenges. The once tight-knit bond between the families began to fray, as infighting and betrayal took center stage. The new breed of Mafia bosses, often younger and more reckless, didn't have the same respect for the old ways that had made Luciano's reign so successful. They were more willing to challenge the status quo, and in doing so, they upset the delicate balance that Luciano had worked so hard to establish. The Mafia was becoming more fragmented, with each family seeking to carve out its own niche, rather than working as a unified entity for the greater good of the entire syndicate. Luciano, while physically absent from the underworld, remained a symbol of the old ways, the methods that had once worked, that had created a profitable, organized system that transcended individual families. In his exile, he became more of a myth, a legend whose ideas were constantly reinterpreted by those who sought to emulate his success. He became an emblem of the Mafia's golden age, even as the very system he had created began to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. His influence persisted, but it was no longer the unifying force it had once been. The world that Luciano had built was no longer the world he had known. As the younger generation of Mafia bosses rose to prominence, they brought with them new ideas, new methods of operation, and, in many cases, a greater willingness to bend or break the rules. The system of cooperation that Luciano had established, which had once allowed the Mafia to flourish, began to give way to a more individualistic, competitive mindset. The once cohesive, unified organization was now a collection of independent empires, each seeking to dominate its own turf. Luciano, watching from afar, could see the writing on the wall. His empire was splintering, and the world of organized crime was becoming increasingly chaotic once again. But even in his exile, Luciano understood that the world he had built was not one that could easily be torn down. The infrastructure he had created, the networks, the alliances, the criminal businesses, was too entrenched, too powerful to collapse overnight. Even as the Mafia grew more fractured, the groundwork Luciano had laid continued to influence the underworld, guiding it in ways he may not have fully anticipated. The years in exile were not easy for Luciano. Although he had once been at the pinnacle of power, he was now relegated to a life of quiet reflection, his empire slipping further away with each passing year. Yet, despite the growing challenges to his legacy, Luciano's place in history was secure. His contributions to the Mafia were immeasurable. He had not only revolutionized the way the Mafia operated but had also ensured that it would continue to thrive for decades to come. His name remained synonymous with power, control, and innovation within the underworld, even as the Mafia moved on without him. Luciano's story was one of constant reinvention, of adapting to the changing tides of power, of recognizing when to fight and when to retreat, and of understanding that even in the criminal world, the game was always changing. His legacy was not just about the empire he had built, but about the blueprint he had created, a blueprint that would continue to influence the world of organized crime long after he was gone. In many ways, Luciano's exile was the final chapter of his life, but it was also the beginning of a new era, one in which his ideas would continue to shape the Mafia for years to come. Even in his absence, the world he had crafted lived on, a testament to his brilliance and his lasting impact on the criminal world. As time passed, the Mafia Luciano had helped craft, the vast, organized machine that spanned the United States and even extended its tendrils into Europe, began to evolve in ways he might not have fully envisioned. The world of organized crime, though influenced by his vision of a unified criminal enterprise, was ever-changing, shifting under the weight of new generations, new technologies, and new ambitions. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Mafia was beginning to look very different from the tightly controlled syndicate Luciano had once steered. Even so, Luciano's fingerprints were all over it, in ways both subtle and profound. In the years following Luciano's exile, his absence left a power vacuum in the world of organized crime, a vacuum that was, as expected, filled by those who sought to dominate what he had built. With his vision of cooperation through the Commission no longer fully in place, rivalries among Mafia families became more pronounced. Younger bosses, including figures like Vito Genovese, Joe Bonanno, and Carlo Gambino, each vied for control over the criminal operations that stretched across the United States. These men were eager to build their own legacies, but unlike Luciano, they were less inclined to broker peaceful agreements with rivals. For them, the Mafia was a battlefield, a place where the old rules could be bent, and power was seized with a heavy hand. While the younger generation sought to consolidate their power, the world Luciano had created continued to function, but not without growing pains. His strategic genius, which had allowed the families to cooperate and operate with a sense of unity, was now being replaced by an escalating arms race for territory, wealth, and control. The mafia was beginning to look less like a well-oiled machine and more like a battleground of competing egos and conflicting interests. Luciano's methods of negotiation, diplomacy, and respect for the boundaries of rival families were slowly being replaced by ruthless competition and violent enforcement. The mafia's emphasis on long-term stability was giving way to short-term power grabs. Yet even as the mafia fragmented, there were elements of Luciano's influence that remained deeply ingrained. The Commission, for all its flaws and the rise of internal conflicts, continued to exist, albeit in a weakened state. The Commission's original purpose, to resolve disputes between families and ensure mutual cooperation, was more important than ever, even as the men who sat on it began to wield their power differently. The very concept of an organized mafia, as opposed to a chaotic collection of rival factions, continued to endure, despite the fractures. Luciano's early work had ensured that the mafia was too entrenched, too powerful, to simply dissolve into chaos. Luciano's exile, while a tactical retreat, was also the key to his lasting power. He had known that in the world of crime, appearances were everything. He had made himself a ghost, rarely seen, but always present in the minds of those who sought to emulate his example. Even as the mafia's landscape became increasingly hostile and competitive, Luciano's name was still synonymous with the underworld. New generations of mobsters were aware of him, often with a mix of reverence and fear. His reputation as the man who had transformed the mafia into a global empire was untouchable, even as his direct involvement in its operations had diminished. The younger bosses, however, were increasingly disillusioned with the older model that Luciano had built. While they still respected his accomplishments, many of them saw him as a figure from the past, someone who had built a system that no longer fit with the fast-paced world they now inhabited. These new mobsters were eager to break free from the constraints that Luciano's system imposed. They were more willing to take risks, to challenge established norms, and to use violence as a means to secure their place in the mafia. The days of making deals over a cup of coffee or brokering peace at a round table were coming to an end. For these new players, the mafia was a business, but it was a business that required speed, aggression, and an ability to adapt to the shifting power dynamics. This shift in mafia culture didn't go unnoticed by the authorities. Law enforcement had long been trying to break the back of the mafia, but it was only in the post-Luciano era that they started to realize just how deeply entrenched organized crime had become. The end of the 1950s and the early 1960s saw a crackdown on the mafia that would mark the beginning of a new phase in the government's fight against organized crime. Yet, despite the increasing pressure from law enforcement, the mafia continued to thrive, albeit in a different form than the one Luciano had envisioned. One of the most notable shifts was the increasing influence of mafia families in politics and business. While Luciano had understood the importance of maintaining a balance between the criminal world and the legitimate world, the new generation of mobsters pushed this boundary even further. They weren't just making money from illegal activities, they were infiltrating businesses, unions, and government institutions at an alarming rate. The mafia was no longer just a criminal organization, it was an essential part of the economic machinery of many cities, especially in the Northeast and along the eastern seaboard. The concept of laundering money through legitimate channels was becoming a major focus, and the mafia's reach now extended into corporate boardrooms and local government offices. In a way, this new era of mafia power marked a return to some of the methods that had been central to the old ways of operating. Corruption, bribery, and violence were still key elements, but with a modern twist. The new bosses were not just relying on traditional crime rackets, they were building vast criminal empires that spanned multiple industries. They had learned from Luciano's example, but they were also keen on adapting to the changing world around them. Luciano, for his part, remained an enigmatic figure. Even as the new generation of mafia bosses began to assert their dominance, his presence continued to loom large. His name was still whispered in dark corners of the underworld, his legacy both revered and resented. The commission he had established remained a force, though it was no longer the unifying body it had once been. Even as power became more fragmented and the mafia's traditional structures began to erode, Luciano's influence remained a silent force in the background. The world Luciano had helped create was growing more complex, more dangerous, and more intertwined with mainstream society. The line between legitimate business and organized crime was becoming increasingly blurred. As mobsters gained power and influence, they were increasingly able to operate with impunity, free from the restrictions that had once limited their activities. The government's attempts to control the mafia were stymied by the sheer scale of its operations and its ability to hide in plain sight. And yet, despite the growing complexity and reach of the mafia, it was also becoming clear that the system Luciano had created could not last forever. The very structure that had once provided order was now a source of its downfall. The Commission, which had been designed to prevent bloodshed and maintain stability, was now embroiled in power struggles and betrayal. The Mafia, once a well-oiled machine, was now a collection of independent factions, each vying for supremacy. In a sense, Luciano's legacy was a double-edged sword. He had created something that was both enduring and fragile, an empire built on cooperation and shared interests, but also one that was vulnerable to the ambitions of those who came after him. The very system that had allowed the Mafia to thrive for decades was now contributing to its fragmentation. The unity that Luciano had worked so hard to build was slowly eroding, replaced by the aggressive and competitive tactics of the new generation. The Mafia was evolving once again, but whether it could survive in this new form was a question that only time would answer. As the 1960s unfolded, the underworld that Lucky Luciano had once reigned over continued to grow, both in influence and in complexity. His once immense grip on the American Mafia had loosened, but his blueprint for a more organized, profitable criminal syndicate remained an undeniable presence in the operations of the Mafia families that now dominated the landscape. The men who inherited Luciano's empire had the task of not only maintaining the power and wealth he had created, but also navigating the shifting tides of law enforcement pressure, changing business practices, and their own internal rivalries. While Luciano may have been physically distant from the Mafia's day-to-day operations, the echoes of his strategies reverberated throughout the criminal world, reminding all that his system of governance, though now being questioned, had revolutionized the Mafia for good. During these years, the Mafia was undergoing a profound transformation. As organized crime adapted to the modern age, the criminal activities themselves became more sophisticated. The old methods of smuggling, bootlegging, and extortion remained, but new opportunities for profit emerged. The drug trade, once considered too dangerous and unsavory for most Mafia families, began to gain prominence. By the mid-1960s, the Mafia was deeply entrenched in the international drug trade, with various families capitalizing on the heroin epidemic sweeping through the United States. It was a lucrative business, but also one that brought about unforeseen complications. The involvement in the heroin trade marked a sharp departure from Luciano's original strategy. He had always been more focused on long-term, sustainable wealth rather than immediate gains. Drugs, on the other hand, were a business that brought both immense wealth and immense risk. As families increasingly fought for dominance in the drug trade, the stability that Luciano had worked so hard to instill in the Mafia began to erode. The introduction of heroin into the Mafia's portfolio was a game-changer, a dangerous gamble that would have far-reaching consequences for the organization and its future. Yet, even as the drug trade threatened to unravel the very fabric of the Mafia, Luciano's system of governance, the Commission, still offered a semblance of order, though the cracks in the foundation were becoming more evident. The Commission, which had been designed to prevent conflict between families by offering a neutral body for arbitration, became less effective as the new generation of Mafia bosses saw the potential for personal gain in disregarding the rules. They no longer viewed the Mafia as a collective enterprise. To them, it was a business to be run with ruthless efficiency and an eye on profits, not a fraternity that required cooperation for the greater good. At the same time, the increasing influence of the Mafia in legitimate business ventures allowed them to operate with more audacity. Luciano had always understood that the key to power was not just in the criminal underworld, but also in the integration of the Mafia with the legitimate world. While the drug trade was pushing the Mafia into more dangerous territories, the move into legitimate businesses like labor unions, construction, and even real estate allowed the Mafia to maintain a hold on wealth and influence. By the late 1960s, mafia families had deep ties to several large-scale enterprises, all of which were controlled through manipulation, corruption, and sometimes outright violence. One of the defining characteristics of Luciano's empire was his ability to build bridges, not just within the mafia, but also between the mafia and political or business figures. Luciano had long seen the value in cooperating with politicians, law enforcement, and other influential figures to ensure the survival and success of his operations. He had been a pragmatist in every sense of the word, understanding that the line between criminal and legitimate business was a thin one. By the 1960s, however, the mafia was pushing the boundaries of this cooperation. As mobsters entrenched themselves in the political system, the nature of their influence became more direct, and their activities more aggressive. However, the alliances the mafia had forged with politicians began to come under scrutiny. The increasing involvement of mafia families in legitimate businesses and the expanding scope of their criminal activities didn't go unnoticed by the government. The 1960s were a time of heightened awareness about organized crime, with figures like J. Edgar Hoover intensifying the federal government's efforts to infiltrate and dismantle the mafia. With the advent of surveillance technologies and an increasing public awareness of the mafia's grip on American society, the underworld faced new challenges in maintaining its dominance. Luciano, despite his legendary status and the respect he commanded, was no longer at the center of this world. The new bosses, though powerful, were vulnerable in ways Luciano had never been. It was during this period that the impact of Luciano's absence began to become even more apparent. The mafia that he had built, one founded on strategic planning, discipline, and organized cooperation, was becoming a more chaotic and fragmented organization. Although Luciano's system had allowed the mafia to flourish in the 1940s and 1950s, it was now showing signs of strain. The very success he had crafted, the unity of the families, the reliance on intelligence and negotiation, was being tested by a younger generation eager to claim power and make a name for themselves. They were impatient, more willing to take risks, and increasingly less concerned with maintaining the old order. By the early 1970s, the mafia had already entered a phase of decline. The generation of bosses who had inherited Luciano's legacy was increasingly fragmented, and new factions began to emerge within the families. Rivalries between families became more open and violent, as mobsters vied for control over drug routes, labor unions, and illicit businesses. The commission, once a tool for maintaining peace and structure, now became a source of constant infighting. Luciano's idea of a unified criminal enterprise was no longer sustainable in the face of such ambition and greed. The very system that had made the mafia a formidable force was beginning to crumble under the weight of its own success. Despite this fragmentation, Luciano's influence remained undeniable. Even as the mafia's structure began to fracture, his name still carried weight. He remained a symbol of the old ways, a reminder of the days when the mafia was an organized, disciplined force. His legacy, however, was becoming increasingly contested. The younger generation of mobsters, while acknowledging his contributions, were more interested in establishing their own empires, free from the constraints of Luciano's more thoughtful approach. The mafia's operations were becoming less about structure and more about power grabs, territory wars, and survival. What had once been a cohesive, systematic organization was now a sprawling, disorganized network of rival factions. The turning point came in the mid-1970s, when several high-profile mobsters were arrested and convicted. The government's crackdown on organized crime intensified, fueled by the public's growing discontent with the mafia's widespread influence. It was in this environment that the underworld realized that the days of unchecked power were over. Luciano, though long dead, had built something that had stood the test of time, but the world had changed. The old ways were no longer enough to maintain the mafia's dominance. As the years passed and the mafia's fortunes began to decline, it became clear that the empire Luciano had built was no longer the behemoth it once was. His death had marked the end of an era, but it was also the beginning of a new, more tumultuous period for the mafia. The foundations he laid continued to echo throughout the criminal world, but the world itself was shifting beneath their feet. The young, hungry mobsters who had risen to power in the wake of Luciano's exile were no longer content to preserve his legacy, they sought to rewrite it in their own image. And yet, even as the Mafia grew more fractured, Luciano's role in its formation remained central. The men who succeeded him, whether they were building vast criminal empires or competing for scraps, knew that they owed much of their success to the man who had transformed organized crime. Lucky Luciano's impact on the Mafia could never truly be erased, even if his vision had been altered, twisted, or discarded in the years following his exile. He had not only built an empire, he had created the template for organized crime itself, a template that would endure long after the world he had known was gone. The Mafia might have changed, but its roots were still deeply tied to the man who had once dreamed of an organized, business-like criminal empire. By the mid-1970s, the Mafia that Lucky Luciano had helped build had become something entirely different from the tightly organized syndicate he once envisioned. His legacy, although still formidable, was increasingly contested and reshaped by the new generation of mobsters who came of age in a world far different from the one in which Luciano had built his empire. While the old guard continued to respect Luciano's contributions to the Mafia, a new breed of gangsters, emboldened by the burgeoning drug trade and their own desires for power, began to redefine the underworld. As the Mafia evolved, it became more violent, more fragmented, and far less disciplined than the system Luciano had constructed. Despite his absence and eventual death, Luciano's influence remained indelible in the undercurrents of Mafia operations, but the cracks in the foundation were becoming glaringly apparent. The drug trade, which Luciano had originally avoided due to its inherent dangers, had grown into a massive and lucrative business by the 1970s. For many of the new generation of Mafia bosses, this was an opportunity they couldn't afford to ignore. The heroin trade, in particular, had reached new heights, drawing the Mafia deeper into the world of narcotics and away from the more traditional rackets that Luciano had relied upon, such as bootlegging, extortion, and labor union manipulation. The profits from heroin trafficking were astronomical, but so were the risks. With the United States becoming increasingly embroiled in the war on drugs, the Mafia's involvement in narcotics trafficking drew increasing attention from law enforcement, which was now better equipped and more determined than ever to dismantle organized crime. Luciano, who had always viewed criminal activities as a means of accumulating wealth and maintaining influence, would likely have been conflicted by the sudden shift in the Mafia's operations. He had built the foundations of a Mafia that operated with a certain degree of structure and discipline, an empire where territory was controlled through negotiations and strategic alliances, not through the chaotic and often deadly violence that became the hallmark of the drug trade. The heroin business, which involved smuggling large quantities of drugs across international borders, required a completely different approach. It was faster, more volatile, and much more dangerous. The old ways, of building alliances, negotiating boundaries, and maintaining a semblance of order, seemed increasingly irrelevant in this new, cutthroat world. The younger generation of Mafia bosses, eager to expand their influence, seized upon the drug trade with enthusiasm, disregarding the more measured approach that Luciano had adopted. With heroin flooding into the United States, the streets of New York, Chicago, and other major cities became battlegrounds for competing Mafia factions. The Commission, which Luciano had established as a governing body to mediate disputes and maintain peace among the families, was no longer able to maintain the same level of control. Rivalries between families became more pronounced, and the structure that Luciano had carefully constructed began to crumble under the weight of greed, ambition, and violence. By the early 1980s, the Mafia was a fractured entity. The golden age of the Luciano era was now a distant memory. The Commission had lost much of its authority as a central governing body. The younger mobsters, many of them from immigrant backgrounds, raised in a world vastly different from the one Luciano had known, were less inclined to respect the traditional rules of the Mafia. For them, the Mafia was not an institution to be revered but a stepping stone to personal wealth and power. The old notion of loyalty to the family and respect for the code of silence, omerta, had been replaced by a more individualistic, cutthroat mentality. As the Mafia structure became more fractured, so too did the way it operated. The days when the mafia was a well-oiled machine, with each family working in tandem with others to ensure the stability of the larger enterprise, were gone. The new bosses, eager to build their own empires, were more likely to resort to violence and intimidation to secure their place in the underworld. Betrayals became common, and allegiances shifted as rapidly as the fortunes of the various families. The mafia, once a symbol of organized criminality, was now a fragmented collection of rival factions, each fighting for dominance in a brutal and chaotic world. Despite the chaos, Luciano's influence still lingered, albeit in a more abstract form. His model of governance, which had placed emphasis on unity, negotiation, and calculated business dealings, continued to influence the way many of the mafia families operated, even as their tactics grew more ruthless. Luciano had created an environment where criminal enterprises could thrive without descending into anarchy, and while his successors may have abandoned his methods in favor of more violent approaches, they still relied on the same infrastructure he had built. The Commission, though fractured and less influential than it had once been, remained an essential part of the mafia's operations, even as its power waned. Some families still tried to abide by Luciano's principles of cooperation and mutual respect, but they were increasingly outmatched by those who favored brute force over diplomacy. As the 1980s progressed, the Italian-American Mafia, which Luciano had brought to prominence, began to face increasing competition from other criminal groups, particularly the Colombians, who were dominating the cocaine trade. The influx of cocaine into the United States created an entirely new set of challenges for the mafia. Cocaine, unlike heroin, was far more profitable and far less complicated to distribute. The Colombian cartels, with their extensive networks and brutal tactics, quickly became the dominant force in the drug trade. For the mafia, the rise of the cocaine cartels represented a direct threat to the power they had once held over the drug market. While the mafia had controlled heroin trafficking, it was ill-equipped to handle the rise of a new drug that was being produced in vast quantities and was far easier to smuggle. The entry of the Colombian cartels into the picture marked the beginning of the end for the mafia as Luciano had known it. The cartel's ruthless tactics and global reach eclipsed the traditional power structures that the mafia had relied upon for decades. The mafia, still recovering from the internal chaos brought about by its increasing involvement in the drug trade, was ill-prepared to compete with such a formidable adversary. While Luciano's system of cooperation and negotiation had served the mafia well in the past, it was no match for the brutal efficiency of the Colombian cartels, who cared little for diplomacy and were willing to use violence as a tool to achieve their goals. As the mafia found itself increasingly sidelined by the rise of the Colombian cartels and the shifting dynamics of the drug trade, its relevance in the criminal world began to diminish. The more sophisticated, more violent, and more resourceful cartels took over much of the territory the mafia had once controlled. The traditional mafia families, once the dominant force in organized crime, were forced into a defensive position, scrambling to hold on to what they could. The mafia's power, once built on strategic alliances and disciplined business practices, was eroded by a new breed of criminal that was more aggressive and less concerned with maintaining any semblance of order. Even as the mafia's dominance began to wane, Luciano's legacy persisted, though it had become a shadow of its former self. The lessons he had taught, about the importance of organization, structure, and strategic alliances, were still relevant, but the world had changed, and the mafia had failed to adapt quickly enough. Luciano had built the mafia into a global power, but the forces he had helped unleash, the forces of greed, ambition, and violence, had overtaken the structure he had carefully crafted. His empire had given way to a new era of criminality, one that no longer adhered to the rules of the past. The world Luciano had known was gone, replaced by a new, more brutal world of crime. His name still commanded respect, but the organization he had once led was now a pale reflection of what it had been. The mafia had reached its peak under Luciano, but in the decades that followed, it would slowly descend into chaos, unable to keep up with the changing times. The drug trade, the cartel wars, and the rise of new criminal organizations spelled the end of the mafia as the dominant force in American crime. The legacy Luciano had built was fading, and as the new era of crime took hold, the world he had created was lost to history, a relic of a bygone age. As the 1990s began to dawn, the Mafia's once dominant grip on the criminal world continued to slip, like sand through an open hand. The underworld was now a vastly different place than it had been during the heyday of Lucky Luciano. The strategies that had once made the Mafia the most powerful force in American organized crime, strategic alliances, careful negotiation, and calculated moves, were increasingly irrelevant in an era where violence, ambition, and an ever-growing drug trade had taken center stage. Luciano's dream of a highly organized, relatively peaceful criminal syndicate, bound together by mutual respect and order, seemed almost quaint in comparison to the brutal chaos that defined the 1980s and 1990s. The underworld was now a battle for supremacy, a race to control new territories and new avenues of profit, with little regard for the old codes of loyalty and cooperation that had once bound families together. In this new world, the Mafia was no longer the undisputed ruler of organized crime. The rise of drug cartels, particularly the Colombian cartels that dominated the cocaine trade, had displaced the Mafia from its former throne. The Colombians had the resources, the network, and the ruthlessness to outcompete the Mafia in nearly every way. The Mafia, once the undisputed master of heroin trafficking, had been caught off guard by the sudden shift in the drug market. Heroin, while still profitable, was no longer the king of the drug world. Cocaine had taken its place, and the cartels had the infrastructure to move it in massive quantities across borders, with little interference from law enforcement or rival groups. As the cartels expanded their operations, the Mafia was forced to adapt, but it was clear that it was losing ground. The old way of doing business, through family allegiances, strategic partnerships, and careful territory management, was losing its effectiveness. The younger generation of mobsters, who had risen to power in the post-Luciano era, were finding themselves outclassed by a new breed of criminal entrepreneurs. These criminals weren't just looking to make money, they were looking to take over the world. They were aggressive, fast-moving, and willing to take risks that the older generation of Mafia bosses had avoided. They didn't care about honor, loyalty, or tradition. They cared only about dominance. The Mafia's inability to adapt to this changing world was its greatest downfall. While the cartels were building vast, far-reaching criminal empires, the Mafia was still stuck in the past, clinging to the old ways. There were still attempts to organize families and run operations in a structured, hierarchical manner, but the power vacuum left by the fading influence of the Mafia was quickly filled by other organizations. And as these new criminal enterprises took over more and more of the drug trade, the Mafia began to retreat, operating in smaller territories, focusing more on rackets like extortion and loan sharking, and less on the global criminal operations that had once been their bread and butter. As the Mafia continued to shrink in power, its old institutions, like the Commission, began to dissolve. Once a symbol of the unity and power of the Mafia, the Commission had become little more than a relic of the past. The families that had once operated in harmony, at least in public, were now fractured, with alliances constantly shifting, and new, more aggressive players emerging from within. The Mafia was no longer a single, unified entity. It was a collection of smaller, competing factions, each trying to maintain control over whatever territory they had left. This fragmentation made it even easier for rival organizations to infiltrate and challenge the Mafia's diminishing power. By the time the 1990s rolled around, the Mafia was a shadow of its former self. But even as its power continued to wane, the legend of Lucky Luciano remained a powerful force in the underworld. Luciano's story had become the stuff of myth. He was the man who had transformed the Mafia into a global force, the visionary who had redefined what it meant to be a criminal mastermind. His influence continued to shape the way mobsters thought about power, control, and business. His legacy was still felt in the undercurrents of organized crime, even if the structure he had created had largely collapsed. But as the Mafia's structure crumbled, the public's fascination with it grew. In the 1990s, media portrayals of the Mafia, such as The Godfather and Goodfellas, brought the once secretive world of organized crime into the mainstream. These films, along with the rising visibility of real-life Mafia figures, turned the Mafia into a cultural phenomenon. While the Mafia's actual influence was waning, its image as the epitome of criminal power and authority was stronger than ever. Luciano's name, still tied to the golden era of organized crime, became synonymous with the rise and fall of the Mafia itself. Yet, as the public continued to romanticize the Mafia, the reality of its decline was unmistakable. Law enforcement had begun to adopt more sophisticated methods for taking down criminal organizations. Surveillance, wiretapping, and informants became powerful tools in the fight against organized crime. The Mafia, once an elusive and untouchable empire, was now more vulnerable than ever before. The arrests of key figures in the 1980s and 1990s, many of them from Luciano's own generation, marked the beginning of the end for the old guard of the Mafia. As the arrests piled up and the family's power dwindled, it became clear that the Mafia, in its classic form, was no longer the formidable force it had once been. But the story of the Mafia did not end there. While the traditional structures of power began to erode, the criminal world was always evolving. New players would emerge to fill the void left by the fading Mafia, and new criminal enterprises would rise to challenge the old guard. The Mafia's decline was not the end of organized crime, it was just the beginning of a new era, one that would be defined by different players and different methods. And even as the Mafia struggled to stay relevant, its history, its connection to figures like Luciano, remained a defining feature of the criminal world. It was no longer the center of the action, but it had shaped the very nature of organized crime in ways that would continue to be felt for years to come. Lucky Luciano's role in the rise and fall of the Mafia was a testament to his vision and his adaptability. While his methods had become outdated, his impact on the criminal world was undeniable. He had not only created a criminal empire that spanned the globe, but he had also shaped the culture and structure of organized crime for generations. Even as the Mafia's power waned, Luciano's legacy endured, and his name remained synonymous with the very idea of criminal enterprise. In the end, Luciano's story was one of both triumph and tragedy, a man who had built an empire, only to see it crumble under the weight of its own success. And though the world he had created was no longer what it had been, the lessons he had taught about power, control, and organization would never be forgotten. The Mafia might have faded from the spotlight, but its legacy, and the influence of the man who had once reigned over it, would continue to haunt the underworld for years to come. The 2000s arrived, and with it, a new chapter in the saga of organized crime. The Mafia that Lucky Luciano had once built, an empire that had once commanded respect and fear, was now barely a shadow of its former self. The criminal landscape had changed dramatically since Luciano's heyday. The rise of new technologies, the spread of information, and the increasing global nature of crime made the old ways of doing business increasingly irrelevant. The younger generation of mobsters, who had risen to power in the 1990s, were no longer following the same rules and codes that had once governed the Mafia. The world was evolving, and the Mafia, for all its history, was struggling to keep up. The digital age had arrived, and with it, new challenges and opportunities for criminals. The Mafia, once a tightly knit, close-knit organization where face-to-face dealings and loyalty were paramount, now found itself operating in an increasingly impersonal and high-tech world. Organized crime was no longer confined to the streets of New York, Chicago, or the back alleys of Sicily. With the advent of the Internet, organized crime had become a global business, with networks extending to all corners of the globe. The Mafia, long a regional force, was now facing competition from other global criminal organizations, each as ruthless and adaptable as the next. In the early 2000s, the Mafia was still clinging to the remnants of its former power. The once proud families, now fragmented and weakened, were engaged in bitter internal struggles for control over what was left of their territory. The old allegiances were gone, and the Commission, once a symbol of unity and order, had devolved into a pale imitation of its former self. The families that had once cooperated for mutual benefit were now competing against each other for scraps of influence. The Mafia had become a shell of its former self, weakened by the forces of time, law enforcement, and internal divisions. Yet, despite its decline, the Mafia still managed to hold on to certain elements of its power. The old practices of extortion, racketeering, and money laundering continued to be the bread and butter of mafia operations. While the big money in the drug trade had largely passed the mafia by, these traditional rackets still provided the families with a source of income. However, the old ways were beginning to show signs of wear and tear. The authorities, now better equipped to investigate and infiltrate organized crime, were closing in on the mafia with unprecedented intensity. The wiretaps, informants, and surveillance techniques that had been pioneered in the 1980s and 1990s were now commonplace tools for law enforcement, making it increasingly difficult for mafia families to operate in the shadows as they once had. The days of men like Luciano, who had carefully crafted a global empire with an eye on long-term power and stability, were gone. The new generation of mafia bosses had little interest in diplomacy, in negotiation, or in maintaining the kind of balance that Luciano had sought to create. They were more interested in immediate profits, in violence, and in expanding their empires as quickly as possible. They were willing to do whatever it took to secure their position in the criminal world, and this often meant resorting to the kind of brutal tactics that had once been the hallmark of the mafia's rivals. The old codes of loyalty, respect, and family had been replaced by a cutthroat mentality in which survival was the only goal. One of the most significant changes in the mafia's operations during the 2000s was its increasing involvement in cybercrime. The digital world, once seen as distant and unfamiliar to the mafia, had become a new frontier for organized crime. As the internet grew, so too did the opportunities for criminals to exploit it. The mafia, always quick to adapt to new methods of making money, found itself increasingly involved in cybercrime activities such as identity theft, online fraud, and hacking. The internet provided new ways to launder money, to run illicit businesses, and to expand the reach of criminal operations far beyond what had once been possible. The old mafia traditions, based on face-to-face negotiations and street-level power, now had to contend with a new form of crime that could be carried out from a computer in any part of the world. This shift into cybercrime marked a dramatic departure from the traditional methods of the mafia. The digital world, with its anonymity and global reach, was a far cry from the close-knit networks of crime bosses and street-level soldiers that Luciano had cultivated. The mafia, once a regional power, was now competing in a global arena with new types of criminal organizations, hackers, cyber thieves, and digital criminals, who were just as ruthless, but far less concerned with maintaining the traditional structures that had governed the mafia for decades. While the mafia still had its hand in traditional rackets, it was clear that the world was changing, and the old ways of the mafia were no longer as effective as they once had been. By the time the 2010s arrived, the mafia had been relegated to the margins of the criminal world. The global cartels, the cyber criminals, and other criminal organizations had all eclipsed the mafia in terms of power and influence. Law enforcement had become more sophisticated, and the mafia was increasingly unable to operate with the same level of impunity it once enjoyed. The once great families of the mafia had fractured even further, with many of them losing their power entirely. Some had turned to less traditional forms of crime, such as drug trafficking and human trafficking, while others had been dismantled by law enforcement or consumed by infighting. Despite its diminished power, the mafia was still a presence in the criminal world. The older generation of mobsters, those who had lived through the golden era of the mafia, were gradually being replaced by younger, more aggressive criminals who had little regard for tradition or respect for the past. The mafia's hold on the underworld was slipping, but its legacy, its name, its mythology, continued to resonate with both criminals and the public alike. The stories of men like Luciano, who had built an empire from the ground up, still captured the imagination of those who looked back on the days when the mafia ruled the streets. Even as the mafia faded into obscurity, it remained a symbol of an older, more ruthless era of crime, an era that seemed to belong to the past. But even as the mafia's power waned, it continued to haunt the criminal world. The mafia's influence on modern organized crime could still be felt in the way that many criminal organizations operated. The old principles of loyalty, respect, and power, which Luciano had instilled in the families he built, continued to shape the way criminals approached business. Despite its decline, the mafia had left a lasting legacy on the criminal world, one that was both respected and feared. In the end, Luciano's vision, his dream of a unified, organized criminal empire, had come to an end. The world had changed, and the forces of law enforcement, competition from new criminal enterprises, and internal corruption had all conspired to bring the mafia to its knees. The world Luciano had built was gone, but the myth of the mafia, the image of the powerful crime syndicate, would continue to live on. The stories of men like Luciano, their rise and fall, their power and tragedy, would continue to captivate audiences for generations to come. The mafia may no longer be the dominant force it once was, but its legacy would never truly fade. The world of organized crime had moved on, but Luciano's shadow still loomed large over it, a reminder of the man who had once reigned supreme. The mafia, once a colossal force that ruled over the criminal underworld, was now relegated to the margins of society. However, even in its weakened state, the influence of Lucky Luciano, whose vision had set the stage for its ascent, still lingered. By the early 21st century, the global landscape of organized crime had shifted dramatically. New, more powerful players had emerged, and the digital world had opened up entirely new avenues for illegal enterprise. Yet, despite the challenges posed by law enforcement, new technologies, and evolving methods of crime, the myth of the mafia, fueled by Luciano's enduring legacy, continued to captivate the imagination. While the mafia as a unified, powerful organization had all but disappeared, the lessons from Luciano's reign still echoed through the veins of organized crime. His brilliance in creating a sophisticated structure, a network that could balance power, money, and influence, had revolutionized criminal activity. The system of checks and balances he established, where the families, although independent, coexisted within a framework of negotiation and respect, was a model that would never be fully replicated. Even as the mafia began to fragment into rival factions and criminal groups, Luciano's innovations were still revered. His empire had once been the pinnacle of organized crime, and though it was no longer the dominant force, its imprint could still be seen in the actions of those who came after. One of the lasting legacies of Luciano's reign was his vision of the mafia not as a chaotic, disorganized group of criminals, but as a multifaceted, highly coordinated enterprise. Under Luciano, the mafia operated like a business, with each family responsible for a specific aspect of the operation. The heroin trade, labor rackets, gambling, and extortion were all tightly controlled, with profits flowing back into the larger organization. The families were interconnected through a series of mutually beneficial relationships, and although each family was fiercely protective of its territory, there was a sense of order and balance that permeated the entire organization. This vision of the mafia as a sophisticated network had set the foundation for its success, and it continued to influence the way criminal groups operated even as the organization itself faltered. As the years went on, however, the mafia began to fracture. The criminal underworld was no longer unified under a single leader or structure. The new generation of mobsters, many of whom had grown up with a different set of values, were no longer interested in maintaining the delicate balance that Luciano had created. They were more focused on immediate gains, operating with a sense of entitlement that was foreign to the old-school bosses. The sense of loyalty and respect that had been central to the mafia's operations was increasingly undermined by internal rivalries, greed, and a thirst for power. Instead of adhering to the traditional rules that Luciano had set in place, these new bosses were more willing to engage in violent turf wars, betray their allies, and operate in ways that would have been unthinkable in the past. The collapse of this sense of order within the mafia had far-reaching consequences. The rise of new criminal enterprises, particularly those involved in narcotics trafficking, human trafficking, and cybercrime, forced the mafia to adapt or risk extinction. While the younger generation of mafia bosses were still heavily involved in traditional rackets, such as loan sharking, extortion, and illegal gambling, the influx of drugs into the United States, especially the rise of crack cocaine, drove a wedge between the old guard and the new. The younger mobsters, hungry for more power and profit, turned to the drug trade as a means of gaining influence. But this came at a cost. The drug trade brought with it not only enormous profits but also immense risks. Law enforcement agencies, armed with more sophisticated surveillance techniques, began to close in on organized crime like never before. Despite these challenges, the Mafia still found a way to survive. Its roots ran deep, and for many of the older generation, the Mafia was a way of life, an institution to which they had devoted their entire existence. Even as the organization weakened, the sense of tradition and loyalty remained. This was evident in the many Mafia families who, despite internal divisions, continued to operate in much the same way they always had. The code of silence, or omerta, still held sway in certain circles, and even as the Mafia became more fractured, its influence was still felt in pockets of the criminal world. Yet, the Mafia's days of power were long behind it. The collapse of the Mafia as an empire was further exacerbated by the changing dynamics of criminal organizations. New players had emerged on the global stage. The Latin American cartels, such as the Medellin and Cali cartels, had become the dominant force in the drug trade, surpassing the Mafia in both power and wealth. The cartels were more ruthless, more adaptable, and more willing to engage in the kind of violence that the Mafia had once shied away from. Their networks spanned continents, and they had the financial resources and military-like organization to fend off law enforcement and rival groups. The Colombian cartels were not just criminal organizations, they were multinational corporations with the same level of sophistication as any legitimate business. At the same time, the rise of cybercrime introduced an entirely new form of organized crime. The Internet became a breeding ground for criminal activity, ranging from identity theft and online fraud to hacking and data breaches. This new breed of crime was global, anonymous, and increasingly profitable. It was a stark departure from the world Luciano had built, where power was derived from territorial control, loyalty, and trust. In the age of digital crime, the Mafia was no longer the central player. While the families still retained a degree of influence in certain regions, they were no longer the dominant force in the world of organized crime. In the midst of this changing landscape, the myth of the Mafia persisted. Despite its decline, the Mafia still captured the public's imagination. The stories of the men who had once ruled the streets, of men like Luciano, who had built an empire from nothing, continued to captivate audiences. The Mafia's place in popular culture remained firmly entrenched, with movies, television shows, and books romanticizing the lives of mobsters and their rise to power. This was a world that had once been real, a world that had shaped the course of history, but it was now relegated to legend. The power that the Mafia once held, particularly in the United States, was a distant memory. Yet, even as the organization became a shadow of its former self, its influence in the criminal world could still be felt. The same principles of power, respect, and loyalty that Luciano had pioneered continued to shape the way many criminals viewed their operations. While the Mafia was no longer a central force in organized crime, the principles that had made it powerful were still relevant. The new generation of criminals, even those who had no direct ties to the Mafia, still looked to Luciano as a model for how to build and maintain an empire. His legacy was one that transcended the organization itself, and his influence remained a quiet undercurrent in the world of crime. Despite its decline, the Mafia's connection to the legacy of Lucky Luciano endured. His rise from humble beginnings to the architect of an empire had inspired countless individuals. The system he had created, for all its flaws, had been one of the most successful and influential criminal organizations in history. Luciano had shaped the Mafia into a global power, and even though that power had crumbled in the face of new challenges, his name remained synonymous with the era of organized crime. As the 21st century unfolded, the Mafia's grip on the criminal world may have loosened, but the legend of Lucky Luciano, like the stories of so many men who had come before him, remained eternal, etched in the history of crime for all time. The early 2020s painted a complex picture for the Mafia. Although the golden age of organized crime was long gone, the remnants of Luciano's empire could still be felt in the undercurrents of criminal activity. The world had changed in ways that Lucky Luciano could not have fully anticipated, but the foundation he had built, one of control, negotiation, and structured power, remained a potent force in certain circles. In an era of global crime syndicates, cybercriminals, and cartels, the mafia, though much smaller and less influential, still had its place. It had not completely disappeared, but it had certainly evolved, adapting to a new world of technology, shifting power dynamics, and growing international competition. In the modern age, the mafia had become more insular and fragmented than it ever had been before. The once grand families that had spanned from New York to Chicago, and beyond, had shrunk. The traditional power struggles between rival factions were still present, but they played out in a vastly different way. The mobsters of today were dealing with different types of territories defined less by geographical boundaries and more by the industries and technologies that had emerged in the 21st century. No longer was the mafia about owning neighborhoods or running bars and speakeasies. Today, it was about money laundering through international financial networks, controlling illicit online markets, and navigating the dark web. The days of the mafia pulling strings behind the scenes of labor unions and construction projects were fading fast. One of the most significant changes in the mafia's operations was its increasing involvement in white-collar crime. The world of finance had become a critical battleground for the remaining mafia families. Money laundering, tax evasion, and fraud were now primary sources of income, often carried out through sophisticated schemes that involved shell companies, fake charities, and cross-border financial transactions. These were not the back-alley deals of the past. This was high-stakes, corporate-level criminal activity that required a different kind of intelligence and skill. The modern mafia had adapted to this new reality, learning to operate within the complex, global financial systems that governed legitimate business practices. This was a far cry from the days when the mafia relied on violence and intimidation to extort businesses and control industries. The new world required finesse, subtlety, and above all, discretion. Technology played an equally important role in the transformation of the mafia. As the internet became more deeply ingrained in daily life, criminal enterprises, including the mafia, quickly adapted. The rise of cybercrime, including hacking, identity theft, and online fraud, provided the mafia with a new avenue for making money, while the anonymity of the internet allowed them to operate with less risk of detection. Cybercrime became one of the mafia's most lucrative industries, as it offered a way to move vast sums of money around the globe, often without leaving a trace. The use of encryption and digital currencies made it harder for law enforcement agencies to track and trace criminal activities. The mafia, long accustomed to working in the shadows, had found a new playground where they could operate without the same level of scrutiny that had defined their past dealings.